The rain had fallen softly on the quiet hills of Napa Valley that morning, painting the vineyard leaves a shade greener and draping the air in the soothing scent of wet earth and rosemary. Somewhere between the fading mists and the awakening warmth of the California sun, a hidden retreat, an old rustic farmhouse turned modern getaway, hummed with a calm serenity. Inside, a worn oak table bore the marks of countless dinners and laughter-filled evenings, and it was there that Keanu Reeves now sat, nursing a steaming cup of herbal tea, his gaze lost in the rolling fog outside. Life had slowed for him in recent months. After decades of action-packed sets, philosophical interviews, and introspective silences, Keanu had found himself in need of something less heroic, more grounding. And while he had quietly donated to dozens of causes and helped people without ever making the headlines, this time was different. This time it was personal. His soul was craving a different kind of healing, one that didn't come from scripts or success, but from connection. He looked over to the open laptop on the kitchen counter. An email was still glowing on the screen, its subject line simple: "Let's cook together. Sandra." That one line had made him smile like he hadn't in a while. It had been years since their last reunion, years filled with quiet admiration and unspoken gratitude. But now Sandra Bullock, his friend, his kindred spirit, his mirror in a world too loud, had proposed something unexpected. A challenge. A cooking challenge. "Let's each cook for a cause," she'd written. "You and me, 1 week, no assistants, no chefs, no help, just us. One meal, one day at a time. The one who brings the most smiles wins. The twist, we do it together. And we donate every single dollar we raise to local shelters." There was no showrunner, no camera crew, no contracts, just two souls who had quietly lived through the spotlight and found comfort in staying away from it. Keanu hadn't replied immediately, not because he wasn't interested, but because something inside him hesitated, not out of fear, but reverence. Sandra was not just a friend, she was a story in motion. Every word she spoke carried a lesson. Every look she gave, a sense of calm. Could he open his world again and let her into his quiet? Was this more than a cooking challenge? But in the end, the answer had come as effortlessly as breathing. He typed only 4 words. "I'll bring the pasta." 2 days later, Sandra arrived, not with paparazzi, not with stylists, but with a reusable grocery bag in hand, laughing as her sunglasses slipped down her nose. "I brought you eggs," she said, stepping into the kitchen like she had lived there forever. "Organic, from a real chicken, can you imagine?" Keanu grinned. "You brought eggs to a pasta battle." "Battle," she teased. "Keanu, darling, this is a symphony." And that was how it began. What was supposed to be a casual 1-week challenge between two old friends soon became something deeper. Sandra had always known that food could tell stories. Meals carried memories. Recipes were stitched with resilience. And as she opened up her notebook filled with family scribbles, old recipes from her mother, and clippings from local cookbooks, she found herself smiling more than she had in months. Their days became rituals. Mornings began with fresh herbs from the backyard. Keanu, surprisingly skilled with a knife, would dice tomatoes while Sandra peeled garlic with theatrical flair. Midday was spent in trial and error, flour flying, sauces splashing, laughter echoing. Evenings were for serving. The challenge part was real. Every night they opened their doors to small groups, firefighters, school teachers, foster children, local nurses, and served a fresh meal. Sandra would decorate the table, Keanu would plate the dishes with near-samurai precision, and then they would sit, break bread, and listen. But it was never about winning. It was about something else entirely. On the 3rd night, a single mother named Maria broke into tears over Sandra's lemon rosemary chicken. "This tastes like my abuela's recipe," she whispered. "I haven't had this since I was 15. Keanu reached across the table, placed his hand gently on hers, and just said, "She's here with you." Moments like that couldn't be rehearsed. That night, as they sat beneath the grapevines under warm string lights, Sandra looked over at Keanu and said softly, "We're not just cooking, are we?" He shook his head. "No, we're remembering." The challenge was nearing its end. With 2 nights left, Keanu surprised Sandra with a note on the fridge. It wasn't a recipe, it was a quote. "The meal isn't the victory, the smile is." Below it, a little arrow pointing to the word tonight. It was his turn to cook, alone. Sandra reluctantly agreed to stay away from the kitchen. Instead, she watched him from the garden bench as he moved with silent rhythm, boiling, mixing, tasting. There was something meditative about the way he approached the stove. Every movement was filled with intention, as if he were preparing a sacred offering. When he finally brought out the meal, a homemade mushroom ravioli with sun-dried tomato sauce and basil foam, he placed it before the evening's guests with a gentle bow, as if presenting art. Sandra took a bite and closed her eyes. "This is not fair," she said, wiping a tear. "You made poetry with butter." Keanu smiled, then stood up, facing the table of guests. "I want to say something," he said. "About this week, about what this food really is. Every plate we served came with a story, and I think maybe we forgot how powerful stories are. We forgot how sharing something as simple as a warm plate can remind someone they still matter. This," he gestured around, "this isn't a cooking challenge. This is a kindness challenge." The table fell silent, even Sandra. "But," Keanu added with a wink, "I still made the better ravioli." Everyone burst into laughter. That night, as they sat side by side on the farmhouse porch, looking out into the star-scattered sky, Sandra leaned her head against Keanu's shoulder. "You know what's funny?" she whispered. "What?" "I didn't come here to fall in love with food again. I came to find something I'd lost." He tilted his head gently toward her. "And did you?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 handwritten checks. One from her, one from Keanu, each made out to a local shelter, each worth a small fortune. "This," she said, "this is what we found, not in the plates, not in the laughter, but in the moments between, the unexpected twists of kindness." He looked at her, eyes warm. "So, what's the final score?" Sandra smiled. "I think we both won, but especially the people we cooked for." He nodded. "Then let's make dessert tomorrow for the kids' hospital." And with that, the silence returned. A comfortable, healing silence, the kind only 2 people who had lived many lives could share. The guest who carried a memory. The morning broke with golden light filtering through the sheer curtains of the farmhouse, dappling the stone floor with warm, flickering patterns that danced like gentle memories. The air was thick with the scent of simmering vanilla and toasted oats. Sandra had woken up early to try her mother's old granola recipe, humming quietly to herself as she worked in the sunlit kitchen. Outside, birds chirped from the treetops, the distant rustle of grape leaves waving like an applause to the calmness that wrapped the valley. For a brief moment, everything was perfect. Keanu entered quietly, barefoot and thoughtful, wearing a plain black hoodie and holding a basket of fresh blueberries he had picked from the garden just before dawn. Without saying a word, he placed them gently on the counter next to Sandra, their eyes locking for a heartbeat that lingered with unspoken connection. She gave a small, knowing smile, her hands covered in honey and oats, and said, "You always pick the best ones." He shrugged. "Blueberries don't hide who they are. That's why I like them." She raised an eyebrow, laughing. "You're comparing berries to people now." "I mean, think about it," Keanu replied, leaning against the kitchen island, his voice calm and reflective. "Some people look perfect but have no flavor. Some look bruised, but they carry sweetness where it matters most." Sandra paused, her expression softening. "Like that girl Maria, the one who cried during the rosemary chicken." He nodded slowly. "She reminded me of someone I used to know." The moment settled quietly, as it often did with them, not because they were uncomfortable with silence, but because they understood its power. In a world constantly screaming, their quiet was sacred. They didn't need to fill every second with noise, just presence. That presence, however, was about to be interrupted. At precisely 11:14 a.m., the old bronze bell near the gate rang, not once, but twice. It was an unusual sound because, for the past 5 days, everyone who had dined with them had arrived by invitation, usually walking in from the nearby village or being driven by someone on the team that managed the donations. But this was different. This felt unexpected. Sandra looked out the window, wiping her hands on a cloth, her face etched with mild concern. Keanu walked outside without hesitation, his long strides slow but steady. As he approached the gate, his eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in curiosity. Standing there in faded jeans and a navy coat with patches on the sleeves was a man in his early 60s. His gray hair curled slightly at the ends, his glasses were cracked on one side, and he held an old brown leather journal close to his chest. "Mr. Reeves," the man said, his voice weathered but steady, "I wasn't sure you'd remember me." Keanu stared at him, the seconds stretching out until Sandra walked up beside him, her apron still on, her eyes darting between them. "Keanu," she asked softly, "who is it?" Keanu took a breath, his voice lower than usual. This is Elliot Marner. He was my first cooking instructor from a long time ago, a lifetime ago. The man gave a small, crooked smile. That's generous. I was more like a grumpy old chef who yelled a lot. Sandra raised an eyebrow. Well, that sounds promising. Come in. They walked back to the house, and as soon as Elliot stepped into the kitchen, something changed in Keanu. Not visibly, but subtly. His shoulders held a different tension, his posture a little more guarded, as if some buried memory had awakened and was testing the strength of the present. Over fresh coffee and blueberry granola, Elliot shared why he'd come. I saw the posts. People talking about how you and Sandra were cooking here, feeding strangers. I wasn't sure if it was true, but I had to see it for myself. Because once when you were just a kid with a broken heart and too many questions, you told me you wanted to cook to heal people. Not act, not fight, not be famous, just cook. Keanu looked down at his bowl, his expression unreadable. Sandra listened carefully, sensing the emotional weight but choosing not to interrupt. Elliot continued, you were 17, lost your mother to cancer. You said the only time she smiled in those final weeks was when you made her soup. You told me you wanted to make people feel safe, loved, warm, with food. Then Hollywood happened. I thought you forgot. Silence. Then Keanu stood, walked to the kitchen window, and stared outside for a long time before speaking. I didn't forget. I just got distracted. Sandra slowly rose too, walking beside him. She placed a hand on his arm. Keanu, we're still in the middle of that dream, aren't we? He nodded slowly. Yeah, we are. That afternoon, the cooking changed. Not in skill, but in purpose. Sandra noticed how Keanu's hands moved slower, more carefully, like he was infusing every slice of tomato and every twist of dough with memories, with care, with something older than just flavor. Elliot stayed the entire day, watching them, occasionally offering small tips, but mostly observing in quiet pride. For dinner, they hosted a group of high school volunteers who had been cleaning parks across the valley. Teenagers with dust on their shoes, fire in their eyes, and hunger in their bellies. Keanu made his mother's lentil stew, thick, comforting, with cumin and coriander, and Sandra baked honey cornbread that made the whole room smell like childhood. The kids devoured every bite, many of them saying it was the best meal they'd ever had. One young boy named Ray spoke up at the end of the meal. He was skinny, with a fading scar near his lip and eyes too old for his age. No one ever cooked like this for me, he said quietly. Not even my mom. I didn't know food could feel like a hug. Keanu froze. Sandra reached for the boy's hand instinctively, but Keanu was already kneeling beside him, his voice calm. You deserve to feel that every day, Ray, you hear me? Every day. Ray nodded, blinking back tears. Later, after everyone had gone, Elliot approached Keanu once more. You didn't get lost, he said. You just took a longer road to come back home. Keanu smiled faintly, the moonlight touching his face as Sandra stood beside him, wiping her hands on her apron once again. And now that I'm here, Keanu said, I'm not leaving the kitchen. Sandra chuckled. Not until you clean the dishes, you're not. That night, Elliot stayed in the guest room, and Sandra and Keanu sat on the porch again, wrapped in wool blankets, a small fire crackling beside them. Sandra turned to him, her tone more serious now. You never told me about your mom, about the soup, about wanting to cook. Keanu took a long breath. I didn't tell many people. I think I was afraid if I said it out loud, it would become a responsibility, something I'd owe the world. But being here with you, it doesn't feel like a burden. It feels right. She nodded. It does, it really does. They sat in silence for a long while, the stars above watching like old friends. And then Sandra whispered almost to herself, what if we turned this into something more? Keanu turned to her slowly. More. She looked at him, eyes shimmering with new light. Not just a one-week challenge, not just meals. What if this became a movement? His brow furrowed in curiosity. A movement. Sandra nodded. A traveling kitchen, you and me, cooking in small towns, big cities, every place that needs healing. We go, we cook, we listen, we raise money, we leave love behind in the form of recipes. Keanu stared at her, stunned by the idea. That's the twist, Keanu, she said. The one no one sees coming, not a twist in a story, a twist in our lives. He looked back at the moon, then down at his hands, calloused now from days of work that didn't require fame or fortune. You know, he said slowly, for once I don't think I need a script to feel real. Sandra leaned her head against his shoulder again. That's because this time we're writing it together. Sandra's secret recipe. The dawn arrived gently, as if even the sun had paused to soak in the peace that had begun to bloom in the farmhouse. A golden hue stretched across the wooden floors, catching in the steam of freshly brewed tea and reflecting off the polished copper pans that hung neatly from their hooks. The kitchen no longer looked like a workspace. It felt like a sanctuary. In the heart of that quiet, Sandra stood motionless, staring down at a folded piece of aged paper that she held delicately between flour-stained fingers. It was yellowed with time, the edges curled like dried petals, and its ink faded into ghostly traces, but she could still read every word by heart. It was a handwritten recipe, her mother's, and behind every ingredient a story waited. She had found it tucked away inside the journal Elliot had left on the table the night before, slipped between pages full of notes and memories. The recipe was for pan de alma, bread of the soul, a name her mother had whispered to her only once, in a kitchen very different from this one, during a stormy evening in New Orleans when Sandra had been just 12. Her mother had said, "You only bake this bread when someone's spirit needs healing, and you don't always know who it's for." For years, Sandra had thought she'd imagined the conversation. Her mother was often enigmatic like that, tender but elusive, leaving behind little breadcrumbs of wisdom that never fully made sense until much later. But seeing the recipe now, hidden away all these decades and rediscovered at this very moment, made something stir deep in Sandra's heart. Keanu entered quietly, as he often did, noticing the way she was holding the paper as if it were a letter from the past. "What's that?" he asked softly, his eyes lingering not on the paper but on her face. She didn't answer at first. She handed him the recipe, then turned back to the sink, rinsing blueberries in silence. Keanu scanned the page slowly, absorbing the strange yet beautiful instructions: crushed sage leaves, braided dough, sea salt, and a note at the bottom that simply said, "Sing while kneading. The bread needs love." "That last part sounds like something your mom would say," he murmured. Sandra gave a dry laugh. She didn't believe in therapy, she believed in food. If you were sad, she baked. If you were angry, she sautéed. And if you were lonely, she made this. He folded the page gently and set it on the counter. "So, do we make it?" She shook her head. "I don't know if I'm ready. That bread, it meant something. It always did. She never made it lightly." Keanu watched her for a moment. "Maybe that's why you have to." Before she could respond, the bell at the front gate rang again. Sandra wiped her hands and walked to the window. This time she smiled. "You're not going to believe this," she said. A young woman was standing there, maybe in her early 20s, holding a small suitcase and a violin case. Her features were delicate, her eyes wide with nervous hope, and her posture screamed both politeness and pain. Keanu stepped outside first, followed by Sandra. "Hi," the girl said, voice barely audible. "I'm Lily. I think you knew my dad." Sandra tilted her head. "Your dad?" "Elliot Marner," she said, clutching the violin case tighter. Keanu blinked in surprise. "You're his daughter." Lily nodded. "He passed away this morning." The world paused. For a long, fragile moment, no one moved. Keanu's jaw tightened, Sandra's hand instinctively gripped the edge of the porch railing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Lily looked down. "He said to give you this," she said, pulling out another envelope and handing it to Sandra. "He wrote it last night before he went to sleep." Sandra opened it with trembling fingers. The letter inside was short. "If you're reading this, then I've already gone. But I didn't come to see the food, I came to see the fire still alive in your hearts. Sandra, make the bread. It's not for you, it's for her." Sandra looked up at Lily, who was now sitting on the step, staring at her shoes. "You play violin." The girl nodded. "Used to, not much anymore." Sandra sat beside her. "Why'd you stop?" Lily hesitated. "When Mom died, Dad gave up cooking, I gave up music. I guess we both lost our songs." Sandra took her hand. "Then maybe today's the day we find them again." The kitchen filled with energy that couldn't be explained, only felt. It was as if Elliot's spirit still lingered between the shelves and spices, watching over them. Sandra unrolled the dough slowly, her fingers dancing in flour like a pianist returning to an old, sacred tune. Keanu prepared the glaze, occasionally glancing over at Lily, who had unpacked her violin and was now sitting on a stool by the window, unsure of what to do. "Sing while kneading," Sandra said, more to herself than anyone else. "That's what she said." Keanu raised his eyebrows. "You gonna sing?" Sandra shook her head, then turned to Lily. "But maybe you can play." Lily hesitated. "I haven't in years." "That's okay," Sandra said. "The bread won't judge." With trembling hands, Lily lifted the violin to her chin. The first note was shaky, hesitant, a ghost of a sound. But then it grew, warming into something that felt like memory and mourning at the same time. Keanu watched her, momentarily stunned. The music filled the room, delicate but alive, and as Sandra kneaded the dough with gentle rhythm, the violin soared higher, painting the air with something holy. By the time the bread went into the oven, the entire kitchen had changed. The energy was no longer about challenge or charity. It had become sacred ground. And when the bread finally emerged, golden and steaming, the aroma filled the farmhouse like a blessing. That night's dinner was simple: vegetable stew, fresh greens, and slices of pan de alma, warm with sage and salt. The guests were a group of young mothers from a local women's shelter, many of them holding infants, all of them carrying invisible wounds. As they ate the bread, something strange happened. One woman who hadn't spoken in 3 days, according to the shelter director, began to hum softly. Another woman started weeping quietly, then laughing through her tears. A young girl said, "It tastes like hope." Keanu and Sandra served in silence, letting the bread do what it was meant to. When the plates were empty and the guests had left, Lily stood quietly in the corner, holding her violin case like it was a lifeline. Sandra approached her gently. "You did something beautiful today." Lily shook her head. "You made the bread, I just played." "That's what made it sacred," Sandra whispered. Keanu stepped forward, handing Lily a small folded paper. It was a list of soup recipes. "These were your dad's favorites," he said. "Keep cooking, keep playing, keep healing." Lily nodded, tears filling her eyes. Later that night, Sandra and Keanu sat by the fire, the stars once again glowing above like 1,000 promises. The wind was softer, the night warmer, and the silence between them deeper than ever. "Elliot came to say goodbye," Sandra said quietly. Keanu nodded, and to pass the torch. Sandra turned to him. "Do you believe that food can carry souls?" He didn't respond immediately. Then he reached out and broke a piece of leftover bread, holding it up. "Maybe not souls," he said, "but it can carry the parts of us we forget. The kindness, the memories, the forgiveness, that's close enough." Sandra smiled. "Then let's keep baking until we run out of recipes." He looked at her, "Or until the world runs out of pain." The letter in the apron. The fourth morning dawned with a restlessness that didn't quite belong to the vineyard. The air felt heavier, like the sky was holding its breath. Clouds moved low and slow across the horizon, but no rain came, only an eerie calmness, a hush before the storm, not the kind that lashes against windows, but the kind that tugs gently at your memories, asking to be noticed. In the old farmhouse, a kettle whistled. Sandra stood barefoot in the kitchen, her hair tied back, her eyes fixed on something small and unexpected: a letter. It had been hidden in the inner seam of an old embroidered apron she had pulled from a dusty drawer in the pantry, a vintage piece her mother had gifted her years ago, the kind of heirloom you don't use but can't throw away. As she shook it out, a delicate paper fluttered to the floor. The envelope was marked only with her first name, Sandra, in a looping, elegant script she hadn't seen since her mother's funeral. Her breath caught. Her hands trembled. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she placed it gently on the counter and busied herself with chopping carrots for the midday prep. But her rhythm was off. Her mind kept drifting back to that envelope, the way it had been so perfectly hidden, like a message deliberately sealed into fabric, waiting for the right moment. And somehow today, after the bread, after Lily's music, after Elliot's goodbye, felt like that moment. Keanu noticed her silence. He entered the kitchen, setting down a basket of rosemary and sage he'd collected from the garden. "Everything okay?" Sandra nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." He said nothing but walked to the counter, saw the envelope and paused. "That looks old." "It's from my mother," she whispered. Keanu pulled out a chair and sat. "Want me to step out?" She shook her head. "No, stay." Sandra opened the envelope slowly, delicately, as if it might crumble in her hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, the handwriting as graceful and deliberate as ever. Her mother had never been one for grand emotional gestures. She expressed herself through small, intentional acts: a perfectly packed lunchbox, a smile during a bad day, a perfectly timed plate of cookies. But this letter, this was something else. "My Sandra, if you're reading this, then it means you finally wore the apron. I always knew you would. Not because you wanted to, but because you needed to. That apron holds memories of meals, of mistakes, of love, and you've always carried them all so carefully. You have a gift, not just for cooking, but for seeing people, really seeing them, and healing them without them ever realizing it. Don't run from that, embrace it. And if ever you're lost, follow the food. P.S. You were always better at biscuits than me. Love you forever. Sandra read the last line aloud, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She folded the letter slowly, reverently, then looked up at Keanu. She always knew. He gave her the gentlest smile. Mothers always do. They didn't speak for a while. The kitchen was filled only with the soft crackle of the stove and the distant chirping of birds that had no idea how profound the morning had become. Then, just as Sandra began wiping her tears and regaining her composure, the bell rang again. Keanu stood, "I'll get it." But before he reached the door, the gate creaked open, and a tall woman in her mid-60s, wrapped in a deep green shawl, walked through without hesitation. Her steps were sure, her face lined but kind. Her eyes, startlingly similar to Sandra's, scanned the property with an eerie familiarity. Sandra walked to the door just as the woman reached the porch steps. "Can I help you?" Sandra asked. The woman smiled. "You already have, for years. I'm Miriam, your mother's half-sister." The world tilted. Sandra's breath caught. Keanu stepped forward, gently placing a hand on her back. You knew my mother." Miriam nodded. "Intimately, we grew up together, same father, different mothers. Your mom never spoke of me, I know. We were estranged. I was rebellious. She chose stability. She chose family. I chose freedom." Sandra was stunned. "Why come now?" "Because your mother wrote to me before she passed. She said one day you'd find the apron, and if you did, I was to find you." Keanu, ever the grounded presence, offered Miriam a chair and a cup of warm ginger tea. They all sat together in the kitchen, the air thick with unspoken questions and the scent of simmering carrots. Miriam unfolded a story that unraveled like a forgotten novel, of a teenage fallout, of a missed wedding, of a Christmas gift returned unopened. And then years of silence. "But she never stopped loving you," Sandra whispered. "No," Miriam said, her voice cracking. "She just stopped knowing how to reach me." As the sun climbed higher, Sandra and Miriam spoke more. About childhood recipes, about their mother's laughter, about the way she used to hum while cooking eggs. They laughed, they cried, they pieced together a picture of a woman they both loved from different vantage points. And somewhere in that blend of memory and regret, Sandra felt something inside her settle. Later that afternoon, they decided to cook together. It was Keanu's idea. 3 generations of wisdom in one kitchen, he said. That's a story no script could match. They decided to cook a family meal, one that Miriam remembered from their childhood. A hearty Louisiana-style gumbo, rich with spices, shrimp, and the soul of generations. Sandra had never made it before, but the instructions flowed naturally from Miriam's lips, and with every stir of the pot, the room felt fuller, warmer. That night's guests were a group of elderly residents from a nearby retirement home, many of whom hadn't had a home-cooked meal in weeks. Some were in wheelchairs, some needed assistance to eat. But when that gumbo was served, thick, steaming, with a side of cornbread and tangy slaw, the room came alive. One old man, who had been nonverbal for months, whispered, "This tastes like Sundays at my mama's table." Miriam wept quietly at the end of the table. Keanu served extra bowls. Sandra held trembling hands, and in those 2 hours the kitchen became not just a place of nourishment, but a sacred circle of memory, redemption, and forgiveness. After the guests had gone, Miriam hugged Sandra tightly. "She'd be proud of you, not because you can cook, but because you remember why you do." Sandra whispered, "Will you stay a little longer?" Miriam smiled, "Only if you teach me your biscuit recipe." Keanu grinned, "She really is family." That night, as they sat under the stars once again, the vineyard glowing under moonlight, Sandra turned to Keanu, her voice softer than usual. "I spent so many years trying to prove myself through achievements, films, awards, but none of that made me feel whole." Keanu looked at her. "What does?" She took a deep breath. This kitchen, this porch, these people, the food, the stories, the healing. This is the first time I've felt like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." He leaned back, arms behind his head. "Maybe the real twist isn't what we do next. Maybe it's realizing we've already arrived." She smiled at him in the dark. "Well, then let's keep serving." He nodded, "Until there's no one left to serve." When fame came knocking, The morning after Miriam's arrival, the vineyard lay in a peaceful haze, with early sunbeams dripping like melted gold through the dewy grapevines. The farmhouse, once a quiet refuge, now pulsed with a sense of movement, of something building. It wasn't just the scent of freshly baked cinnamon scones or the echoes of laughter drifting from the kitchen where Miriam and Sandra danced between chopping boards and measuring cups. It was something deeper. As if the universe had started turning a little differently around this unlikely sanctuary. This place where hearts came to be unburdened through food, stories, and compassion. But even in sanctuaries, the outside world finds a way in. Around mid-morning, Keanu stood on the porch sipping his coffee when he noticed a sleek black SUV inching up the gravel road. The contrast was stark, modern, and imposing against the serenity of the landscape. He narrowed his eyes, instinctively protective of the peace they had nurtured. Sandra stepped beside him, her brows furrowing as the car rolled to a quiet stop and the tinted window lowered. Out stepped a woman in oversized sunglasses, a beige designer trench coat, and heels entirely impractical for gravel. Her shoulders were tense, her body language defensive. She removed her sunglasses slowly, revealing eyes that once lit up red carpets and magazine covers. Annika Lane, the former pop superstar and once Hollywood's golden child, until she wasn't. Scandal, exhaustion, rehab, her name had vanished from the headlines as quickly as it had risen. "Keanu," she said, her voice cracked, low, almost unfamiliar. He didn't move immediately, then something softened in his expression. "Annika." Sandra stayed beside him, calm but alert. Keanu turned toward her and whispered, "We worked together years ago. She disappeared after the fame chewed her up." Annika looked around hesitantly. "I didn't come for pictures, I didn't come for press. I came because I heard what you're doing here, from Elliot. Before he died, he wrote me a letter, too." Sandra's breath caught. "He said if I still had a soul left, I should come find it in this kitchen," Annika continued, her voice breaking. They said nothing, just opened the gate. The transition wasn't smooth. Annika, once the center of every room she entered, now flinched at every sound, like she feared the world might explode at any moment. She didn't know how to chop onions, didn't know how to set a table without checking her reflection, and winced every time she made a mistake. She apologized constantly, and the kitchen, once her stage, now became her confession booth. Sandra observed quietly, letting Annika struggle but never shaming her. Keanu, in his usual way, offered calm instruction. "Start with this, peel the garlic, slow is okay." It took 2 hours to prep a simple soup, but by the end of it, Annika had cut 3 cloves and didn't cry once, not from the garlic at least. That night's guests were young artists from an underfunded local performing arts school, dancers, painters, poets, singers, kids with big dreams and uncertain futures. When Annika saw them entering, something in her froze. She slipped out to the porch, trembling, hiding behind the rose trellis. Sandra found her there. "You okay?" Annika shook her head. "I don't know how to face them. I used to be them. I used to believe in the magic of all this. But the world ate me alive, Sandra. I don't know how to be anything but broken now." Sandra leaned beside her. "You're not broken, you're healing. There's a difference." Annika gave a bitter laugh. "People only want you when you're perfect. The world only loves you until you mess up. I messed up." Sandra turned to her fully. "Then this is the best place you could be, because in this kitchen we don't serve perfection, we serve healing, and that takes courage." Slowly, Annika returned inside. She didn't perform, she didn't speak much, but she served, quietly, humbly, and for the first time in years she fed someone not for applause but for connection. After dinner, one of the young poets, a boy with a stutter and a brilliant mind, approached her shyly. "You're Annika Lane," he whispered. "My mom used to play your songs every day when I was little. She said your voice saved her during chemo." Annika's eyes filled. She nodded, managing a soft "thank you," before stepping outside again, this time to weep freely beneath the stars. The next morning she woke before anyone else. She made pancakes, terrible, burnt, misshapen ones, but they were hers. Keanu found her in the kitchen, flipping a lumpy piece with too much oil, and raised a brow. "Don't say it," she said. "I wasn't going to," he replied, "but maybe turn the heat down." They laughed, a real laugh this time. She sat down beside him, nibbling on the edge of her failed pancake. "It's funny," she said. "I spent millions building a brand, managers, stylists, social teams. None of it made me feel useful. But here, with a spatula and a broken stove, I feel needed." "You are," Keanu said. And not because of what you used to be, but because you showed up. Annika stayed another 2 days, and when she left, she didn't take selfies or post videos. She left behind a note for Sandra and Keanu, scribbled in smudged ink. This place reminded me of my worth. I hope someday I can create a kitchen like this, for people like me who lost their way. Thank you for letting me fall apart quietly. You helped me piece myself back together without asking me to perform. Sandra folded the note, tucked it beside her mother's recipe in the drawer, and said to Keanu, This is what we're doing, isn't it? He nodded. We're feeding the forgotten parts of people. That evening, as a soft drizzle began to kiss the valley and the fire crackled in the hearth, Sandra sat curled up in the reading chair with a leather-bound journal in her lap. I think we need to write these stories down, she said. Keanu looked up from the table where he was polishing old silverware. You mean like a cookbook? No, she said, closing the journal gently. Like a memory book with recipes, yes, but with the stories too, the people, the laughter, the healing. Every meal here had a soul. We need to preserve that, not for us, for others. Keanu smiled. Then let's start with page 1. What do we call it? Sandra tilted her head, then looked toward the apron hanging near the stove, the one with her mother's letter hidden in its seams. She whispered, Pan de Alma. He nodded slowly, bread of the soul. They lit a candle and began to write. The table that touched the world. It had been exactly 3 weeks since Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves stood quietly in that kitchen for the first time. Just two old friends with a cooking challenge and no grand plan. What had begun as a playful act of kindness, a retreat from fame, had unraveled into something neither of them could have imagined. Now the farmhouse held the echoes of so many voices. Strangers turned friends, forgotten hearts remembered, and fractured souls mended by the simplest yet most sacred ritual. Cooking together, eating together, healing together. The sun hung low over the vineyard that morning, casting long golden beams across the garden as if the earth itself were bowing to the grace that had blossomed on this soil. Sandra stood beneath the lemon tree, its fruit bright against the green, plucking a few for the day's lemonade. Her movements were slow but purposeful, her mind not on the lemons, but on the letter that had arrived an hour earlier on official letterhead, hand-delivered by a courier who simply said, It's urgent. It's from the United Nations. She hadn't opened it yet. Inside the farmhouse, Keanu was folding napkins with Miriam, their laughter light as air. Lily, Elliot's daughter, had returned for a weekend and was tuning her violin in the living room. Every corner of the home was now filled with little pieces of life that weren't there weeks ago, an old recipe pinned to the fridge, handwritten notes on sticky paper stuck to cabinets, a whiteboard listing upcoming guests. This wasn't just a retreat anymore. It had become a movement, and someone outside had noticed. Sandra returned to the porch, still holding the unopened envelope. Keanu looked up from the table, caught her gaze, and said nothing. He didn't need to. She sat beside him, slipped her finger beneath the seal, and unfolded the crisp stationery. She read silently for a long time. Then finally, she whispered, They want us to come to Geneva. Keanu raised a brow. Geneva. She nodded slowly. The United Nations is launching a new global initiative focused on trauma recovery and emotional wellness. They want to partner with us. Our story, it's been circulating. Apparently someone recorded our dinner with the young poets. One of them posted it online. It went viral, 22 million views. Keanu leaned back in the chair, absorbing it, his expression calm. And they want us to speak. They want us to teach, Sandra said. To bring this model to shelters, schools, refugee camps all over the world. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The gravity of what they'd unintentionally created settled around them like a soft fog. Then Keanu smiled gently. We didn't just open a kitchen, Sandra. We opened a language. A week later, they were in Geneva. Not under the lights of a movie set or the flashing bulbs of paparazzi, but on a modest stage in a conference hall where global leaders, educators, and health workers gathered. Sandra stood behind the podium, a modest navy blouse, her apron tucked into her bag, and a heart full of every story they'd fed and been fed by. Keanu stood beside her, notebook in hand, his voice steady but warm. We're not chefs, Sandra began. We're not therapists, we're not activists. We're just two people who sat down at a table and asked a simple question, what would happen if we used food to listen? Keanu followed. We've cooked for children who lost parents, artists who lost hope, elders who lost memories, and every time we didn't just serve meals, we served meaning. We told people without saying a word that they still mattered. They played no flashy videos, no promotional footage, just shared pictures of gumbo and bread, of fireflies above a vineyard, of laughter, of tears. And slowly the room began to change. Delegates wiped tears from their eyes, ambassadors stood in ovation, and something bigger than a speech began to take root. After the presentation, they were approached by NGOs, educators, mayors, and even a renowned psychologist who said, "What you've done, it's culinary compassion, it's scalable, it's revolutionary, and it's what the world forgot it needed." In the months that followed, the Table Project was born. With quiet funding and no corporate logos, Keanu and Sandra began training small teams across the globe, teaching not just recipes but rituals, how to listen without judgment, how to serve with dignity, how to build trust with time and basil, not bureaucracy. The first pilot kitchens opened in Detroit, Nairobi, a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan, and a school for war-affected children in Ukraine. And everywhere the model landed, the result was the same. Silence melted, hearts opened, and stories poured out. Sandra flew to Guatemala to help a women's collective start their own version using ancestral recipes. Keanu went to Alaska, teaching a native youth center how to blend traditional hunting meals with modern emotional healing. Lily, now a full-time volunteer, played violin in trauma shelters where words had failed for years. And back at the farmhouse, Miriam kept the hearth warm for the local community, hosting monthly dinners where no one needed to RSVP, and everyone left a little more whole than they arrived. One rainy evening, nearly a year after it all began, Sandra and Keanu returned to the farmhouse, exhausted but fulfilled. They had been away for months, traveling from camp to camp, city to city, and now they stood once again on that familiar porch where it had all started, with a bowl of lemons and an email titled, "Let's cook together." They didn't speak at first. Sandra walked into the kitchen, hung her apron, and stood before the stove in silence. Keanu entered behind her, dropped his backpack by the door, and said, "One last meal." She nodded, "One last meal." They cooked slowly, deliberately, just the two of them. No guests, no audience. Just garlic and onions sizzling, bread rising, herbs crushed by hand. And when the table was finally set, they sat opposite each other, candles flickering, their expressions unreadable but their eyes full of everything they had become. Sandra lifted her glass, "To Elliot." Keanu lifted his, "To your mother." Sandra added, "To Annika and Ray and Lily and Miriam." Keanu raised his glass a little higher, "To the ones who came hungry and left remembered." They drank in silence. And for a long while they just ate, slowly, mindfully, until Sandra leaned back in her chair, looked around the kitchen, and said, "Do you ever wonder how different life would be if we hadn't opened that email?" Keanu smiled. "I wonder what would have happened if we'd ignored it." They both laughed. And then Sandra said something that made Keanu pause. "We've built something beautiful, but it's time to pass it on. The world needs kitchens like this, hundreds of them, and we can't be everywhere." He nodded slowly. "So we teach." "Better," she said, eyes glowing. "We inspire." The Table Project didn't become a corporation. It didn't sell products or launch a brand. It became a movement. One that passed through hands like recipes handed down by grandmothers, quietly, personally, lovingly. And years later, long after Sandra and Keanu had returned to their quiet lives, long after the spotlight had moved on, someone walking through a village in India or a small town in Canada or a neighborhood in Cape Town might stumble across a humble little room, lit by warm light and filled with the smell of rosemary and garlic, where the table was long, the seats were many, and the sign at the door simply read, "Come as you are already enough." And if you asked who started it all, no one would mention actors or fame. They'd say, it was two people, they cooked one meal, and it changed everything. The end.